So welcome everyone to Meditation Mount and to this month's View from the Mount, and we'll be focusing on the theme, the lightness of joy in dark places. So let's begin with a brief alignment to gather our forces and to create a group field in which we can journey together. Let's do this by taking a few deep, gentle breaths to become centered and relaxed, releasing any tensions that may be held inside our physical body. Any tensions inside our emotional field. And any tension inside our mental body, our mind. Let's take a minute just to relax and bring ourselves fully present. Thank you. It's always good to be centered in these times when the planet's somewhat wobbly. So, as I said, we're going to be focused on this particular theme of the lightness of joy in dark places. And joy has been called in the Agni Yoga teachings a special wisdom. Joy is a special wisdom. That's a phrase that you meet throughout the teachings. So joy illumines and warms our hearts, and it sheds a welcome light on the path ahead as we traverse the dark places of earth. And I'm referring both to the inner and outer terrain of incarnated life. So today, I'd love to explore with you the nature of joy, to understand its potent gift of fiery hope, and also the assurance that it brings of a heart-lighted future. And we're going to be doing all of this while navigating the dark period we are presently moving through as a human family. It's not an easy time to be alive, and yet we are being called to be fully present in order to be points of stability and points of light and points of hope inside the field that is at the moment somewhat shaky. So I'd like to begin with a question, and this was posed by a friend of mine last month. And the reason I'd like to pose it, because I'm assuming that many of us have had similar ponderings. So this was the question: how can I be truly joyful while surrounded by so much suffering? How can I be truly joyful while surrounded by so much suffering? It's a great question. So what I'd like to do is, there are many ways of responding to this, and I have a few thoughts, and I'd like to offer these musings as a way to begin our exploration. So let me just sort of give you a sense of what I'm seeing and what I see is in front of us. So that what I would call the jagged and jarring scenes of suffering that fill our collective field of vision, the ones that we see on social media all the time, they surface feelings of despair and despondency. And I see them as the precipitates and products of past thoughts and actions. Now, in contradistinction to this pain, the heart-lighted joy we sense burning deep inside the innermost repository of the heart when we really tune into it is what I would call the eternal presence of fiery hope. I believe there are hope-filled seeds of new possibilities that contain the promise of a brighter future waiting to be called forth and sown. But before we can sow these seeds, we first have to clear and prepare a suitable space in which they will germinate and flourish. So what I'd like to do is to, with the first slide, just share a distinction or distillation of what I basically just said. And this is a short form version. The pain of the past lingers in the present as a dark foreboding cloud that obscures the light of the soul, creating a sense of ceaseless suffering and hopelessness that dampens our creative spirit. The unshakable faith and expectancy of a brighter future, sensed deep inside the heart, shines in the present as radiant joy, and it liberates the energy of the soul and allows us to show up as a powerful force for good and active agent of positive change in the world. So what I sense is that we've got these two things going on simultaneously, side by side, and they're very different. The pain of the past evokes the suffering, the sense of suffering, until we've cleared it, until we've faced up to all the unredeemed aspects of ourselves. And we've covered this in other View from the Mount broadcasts. And then the whole thing of joy. Joy is what happens when we allow the vision and the promise of this brighter future to enter our heart. And it's as though we are being asked to bring the present alive and allow the future to occupy the present and not the pain of the past. And that's a huge task. And so when I look around the world at the moment and try to make sense of it, the story I tell myself is that what we're witnessing is the natural outworking of the spiritual axiom that states energy follows thought. So whenever we seed and broadcast into the ethers any thoughts, any feelings, anything from the inside must eventually show up and take form on the outside. So I would say our karmic chickens are coming home to roost. That's one way of saying it. So I look at the present drama that we're in the midst of at the moment, the drama that's being played out in the world stage. And it's being played on the world stage by what I would think is a global cast of characters. And it really is a vivid portrayal of all the things that we've set in motion together over the decades. I look at the characters that are the lead characters in the nations, whether they're the presidents or the governors or whatever they are. I see every person representing a character that's been created out of our own thinking, is a result of how we've chosen to live this life. So the question is, do we like the story? But for the new story to be endowed with our highest qualities and aspirations, it needs to be crafted both by the heart and the mind in every moment of every day. So the crafting of this new story, for me, is a joyful invitation to participate in, if you like, a magnum opus of our one humanity. And we're being invited to be co-authors of a new society, a new civilization. And this invitation is being issued by what I would call the soul of humanity. That aspect of ourselves that is integrated, aligned, that knows the promise of the future. So where we stand at the moment is that each of us has a choice as to how we will most powerfully and effectively respond to this creative opportunity. I think on the downside, failure to respond ensures that the old and the past continues to reign. So if we're entrapped in the old story, if we've lost faith, if we're unable to sense the longed-for brighter future that's already emerging, how do we break through? There is an Indian environmentalist called Arundhati Roy, and she had this very beautiful sentence that she wrote, which really addresses the concern I just voiced. She said, "Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, if you listen carefully, you can hear her breathing." I think it's a wonderful way of saying it, because it isn't like a future is a plan that we've got to unfold. It's a living entity. The future state is already held inside of us as a potential, as a promise, as a desire. Now, what we have to do, because we're living in dark times and we're being asked to be bearers of light. So, understanding and resolving the conundrum of pain and joy coexisting inside the same temporal arc is really an urgent task facing us if we're going to remain positive, and if we're going to remain undeterred by the implosions and the perturbations of a society in upheaval. A lot of people do not have firm ground upon which to stand, firm inner ground, and therefore they don't know what's happening, they're being thrown around. I believe that we have to become as soul-centered as is possible, because in the light and love and wisdom of the soul is found true security. But going back to this whole difficulty of holding joy and suffering together, I know from my own experience that it is all too easy to feel guilty for being joyful in a world full of suffering. I remember as a young person, I struggled with this. And one of the things that really helped me break through this and to resolve this inner conflict was something that Dr. Roberto Assagioli shared in one of his lectures over 50 years ago. And as you know, Dr. Assagioli is the inspiration behind Meditation Mount. He's also a spiritual psychologist who created psychosynthesis. He was also a student of the Master DK that you can read about in the Alice Bailey materials, the books. So this is what he wrote, and this has really helped me understand that I don't need to feel guilty. So Dr. Assagioli said, spiritual joy is a duty towards others. At every step on our way, we should help our brothers and sisters to share in the treasures which we have discovered, in the benefits which have been showered upon us, in the powers which are developing in us. This is the unchangeable law of justice and of love, the direct expression of the fundamental unity of all beings. Thus, whoever attains the first illuminations must share them with others. One of the most effective ways of doing this is by pouring out upon them our own joy. That's a pretty powerful statement, and it really helped me shift from feeling guilty. How can I feel joyful when those around me or life in general is full of suffering? And it helped me understand that this is what it means to bring light into a darkened world. First of all, I have to bring light into my own darkened world. I have to look at all the parts of myself that are still in darkness, that are still unloved, that are still unredeemed. And I have to bring joy into my own personal life. And I was privileged to know Dr. Assagioli back in the early 70s. He died in 1974, so I knew him for a few years. And when you met Dr. Assagioli in person, there was just this smiling wisdom. He had an incredible smile and a sense of joy. Now, he himself had been through some really tough times. His son had died. He'd been imprisoned in Italy during the Second World War. He was Jewish. He had done a lot of things he had a tough life, and yet through it, he carried this flame of hope, this fire of hope, and this sense of joy burning in his heart. So throughout all of his talks, he always pointed out that the illumined soul, which has vitally experienced the purifying and elevating action of suffering, not only does no longer flee it, not only endures it patiently and accepts it with goodwill, but finally comes to rejoice in it. So he had reached a point where he was rejoicing in the suffering as the source of pain or joy through pain. And he would say that joy is the strength of the spirit to render the cross light. So the cross that we're bearing, it makes it light. Our burden is light. And joy is the light of the spirit which renders the cross luminous. So it isn't though it's easier to carry the cross, we can actually bring light into the darkness and, if you like, get off the cross, out of the crucifixion of light into matter, and become resurrected. So joy is one of those attributes that helps lift us out of the darkness and to bring light into that darkness. So I found Dr. Assagioli's words very reassuring and very, very illuminating. So one possible personal response to what's happening in the world at the moment is to develop and expand a compassionate heart. A heart that can both hold and heal the pain and trauma of the past, and also function as a welcoming field of birth and nurturing in which the dreams of this more just and joyful future may successfully grow and glow. So the heart is both that which can help process the alchemical process and transmutation of pain into joy, of darkness into light, but it's also the birthing field of the new possibilities. It's easy to get overwhelmed in these times and feel that our lives don't mean anything. I believe it's incredibly important to remember that each one of us, each of our daily lives, are neither petty nor meaningless. In fact, they're cosmic in scope. And despite all the daily indications to the contrary, each one of us is playing a vital part in the grand outworking of this Holy Trinity that lives inside us. And that Holy Trinity is truth, goodness, and beauty, to bring it into form on earth. And we've mentioned this before, that each one of us is like a sacred fractal of a boundless unified field. And so our deep history is interwoven with this vast and never-ending story of creation. I think that's when it really comes home, the lightness of joy, is that it isn't just how we get through the tough times. It affirms that we are the light bearers. To the degree that we release the light in our own being, and therefore we can deliver the promise of the future into the present. But if we don't have joy in our hearts, if it's just despondency and despair, the present is filled with the pain of the past. And it's pretty straightforward. And yet the process of redeeming this is a daily task. It requires our full attention. It requires our full commitment. And I know many of us have made that commitment, whether we're in recovery from addiction or whether we've chosen a spiritual path, whether we've chosen to be kinder to ourselves and others, whatever path we've chosen, it's leading us to a place where we can participate joyfully in life. I referred to the Agni Yoga teachings at the beginning of this broadcast. What I like to do is to show you a few quotes from Agni Yoga on the theme of joy, and then just ponder on them with you together. And you'll see it says Fiery World, Book 1, 1933 when it was written, and the sloka, or the paragraph number, is 663. So in case you wanted to look it up later. The quote says, "How can one attain success? Remember, through joy, not through despair, but joy. Do not for an instant believe that we ponder the probability or improbability of success. The thought is, does your joy suffice to quicken the ascent? We always counsel joy. It is necessary to realize and remember that you have succeeded when you rejoiced. Certainly, this is not the frisking of a calf on the meadow, but the creative joy which transforms all difficulties. The play of the mother of the world is in joy. She enfolds the enlightened ones in her veil of joy. Rejoice amidst flowers and in the midst of snow, equally redolent. Also rejoice." So this is a call to joy, to be joyful. And then the next quote is about being joyous. as it says here. Be, be, be joyous, not through desire, but through the striving of spirit. Be joyous, not through ancestral desires, but through the command of the entire consciousness in order to create that luminous thread which unites all worlds. Be joyous, not because of the success of works already decayed, but in knowledge of the predestined and of that already inscribed in the scrolls of the future. This is just what we've been referring to. Be joyous, not in the desire for repose, but because of the agitation of the elements, since only the agitation of the elements will serve you, for one cannot command the dead to revivify the living. Thus understand that joy is a special wisdom, and do not abandon the fires of light above the crumbs of the feast. So these sort of very powerful and strong words are saying, look, you can only give birth to something new out of joy. But it's not the joy of things already achieved, it's the joy of this promise of the future that is coming alive in us. So this is the test we're facing. So as a society, it's obvious that we're living in very extreme and very tense times. But if you look at what these extremes and these tensions do, we can actually utilize it like a good sailor can tack against the wind. You can use the elements, and in Agni Yoga it's called tactica adversa. Whatever is thrown at you, like Aikido, you take it and you can use it to move you forward. So when suffering comes, or when something quote unquote bad happens to you, there's a way of taking it and moving it forward. I mention this because at the moment, as I say, we're living in very extreme times, times of tension. I'd like to explore the inner tension that always exists inside of us that is a positive opportunity. It's created by the gap between our ideal of what life could be, which is our dream of the future, and our present capacity to realize and to deliver on this dream. That's always the gap. I used to call it, when I lived at Findhorn and was teaching there, the community in Scotland, called it the God gap. It's the gap between the truth of who we are at the deepest level and our ability to show up in its fullness. There's always this gap. So the creative gap generates a sense of dissatisfaction, but it also stimulates a renewed call from the soul to close the distance between the two. So I believe we can utilize the tension between joy and suffering, for instance, to strive towards new possibilities that do, in fact, express the inherent truth, goodness, and beauty that live at the heart of who we are. I mean, the Greeks talked about truth, goodness, and beauty. It reflects what we know from the ageless wisdom teaching and the esoteric lens. If we look through that lens, these are the first three rays, the first, second, and third rays that gave birth to everything. These are the three primary colors that make the color on this liquid crystal screen that you're watching this broadcast on possible. So truth, goodness, and beauty, that's the Holy Trinity, if you like, that lives inside of us. But what I want to refer to is the fact that the ageless wisdom teaching also speaks of divine discontent and dissatisfaction. It actually uses the word divine discontent and dissatisfaction. And it's the dynamic tension between the eternal promise held within the essential seed of self, and as I said just now, our present inability to express this inner truth. So the spark gap between the two dimensions generates a fire of deep desire to seek further levels of skill, capacity, and maturity in the ceaseless striving towards fulfillment and self-realization. And the word striving is used frequently in the Agni Yoga teachings. Striving is this fiery pull towards the fullness of who we are. It's striving is not so much sort of pushing through everything to get to a personal goal. Striving is the momentum of allowing life to call to us and move us forward. So I would say that discontent is the dynamo that drives all life forward. It's the compelling, impelling, and propelling force that never lets us become satisfied or rest on our laurels. I know a lot of people, all they want is peace and quiet, which means, go away, leave me alone. I just want to sit here forever on this couch. You can sit on the couch for a while to gather yourself, to give thanks for what's just happened, or just bring yourself back to center. But we're not incarnated on earth to be couch potatoes. I think that's pretty obvious. Our soul, in fact, is a dynamic presence of radiant light, love, and joy. And it won't allow us to wither on the vine, to be the couch potato. It won't allow us to sink into the illusory comfort and immobility of status quo. So that's the whole idea of divine discontent, is this dynamo. It moves us forward. Otherwise, life would just say, oh, that's it. We've reached it. Now let's stagnate together. And therefore, it doesn't regenerate. So it's part of the process of regeneration, the striving. So divine discontent continually conspires to disrupt our periods of quiet repose and to ensure that what we dream in our hearts is realized in what I would say is full, fiery, embodied beauty through right thought and right action. We go back to some of the Buddha's teachings of the Eightfold Path: right discernment, right speech, right action. But where does the rightness come from? It comes from rightness, which is another way of saying justice. And the truth, which is what justice is, lives inside our soul as one of the aspects: truth, goodness, and beauty. So let's go back to this spark gap. If the spark gap becomes too wide and unbridgeable, instead of igniting and inspiring us to quicken our steps on this upward spiral path of growth, the field actually collapses. And when the field collapses, it's very easy for us to sink into a state of despondency and despair. And sadly, as I hinted at earlier, this is what we see around us in many parts of our local and global community. People only see the darkness. They only see the suffering. They don't see a get out of jail card. They don't see any way out of this. So much of our humanity, our brothers and sisters around the world, are discouraged and trapped in this yawning gap. And we have to come to terms with the painful realization that what we see around us, we have created. This modern society that we've created maybe doesn't yet fully honor the principles, values, and qualities of the soul that we know without even putting it in words. We know in our heart of hearts, in our soul, when something is right, when something's on, or when something's off. So these are crucial times, intense times, and therefore it's calling us to show up. So one of our main tasks of community service could be to rekindle the fire of hope in the heart of our one humanity. And by rekindling this fire of hope, it hopefully will lead us from what the ancient Vedic text calls from darkness into light, and from the unreal to the real. Now this we attempt to do at Meditation Mount through the principles and pathways that we've named in other broadcasts. But let me just pick on one, because it pertains to the inner truth of who we are. It's the principle of essential divinity. And this principle declares and assures us that a spark of the eternal flame actually lives and burns steadily and constantly in the heart of each one of us. So inside us, in our heart of hearts, there is this eternal flame, which is the fire of love. But then it gets obscured. We haven't developed the skills to constantly express it, or even to be in touch with it. But by recognizing the shared reality of a deep identity, by recognizing the principle of essential divinity, so when I meet you, I see the divinity in you. This is what the Indian greeting, namaste or namaskar, comes from. I salute the divinity in you. That's a wonderful greeting. So once we recognize that in each other, we can draw upon a greater strength in a collective field. We can draw upon shared courage to persevere, because we have to persevere together through a very challenging psychological landscape that resembles, I think, what the 23rd Psalm in the Bible calls the valley of the shadow of death. So I know I'm using strong words, but these are strong times. These are powerful and potent times. And the potency and the flaming presence of the one life residing within each one of us that we've called the principle of essential divinity, that really is the true fire of love and hope. And what I'd like to do is to remind ourselves, using the words of Teilhard de Chardin, of what this potent fire means and why it's so important now. So this is what Teilhard wrote, and you're probably familiar with this quote. Someday, after we have mastered the winds and the waves and the tides and gravity, we shall harness for God the energies of love, and then, for the second time in the history of the world, humankind will have discovered fire. So this is, it's happening now. The second time in the history of the world, humankind will have discovered fire. So in order to pierce the darkness that currently engulfs us and enshrouds us, we have to call upon and ignite and generate this second fire, which is the fire of love inside the heart. And once again, the Ageless Wisdom teaching says the only way out of the darkness, the present darkness, is for the fire of love to be kindled and to burn brightly in the cave of the human heart. Uses that phrase. It's the appearance of the presence of a greater love, the presence of this fire of love inside the cave of the human heart. And as we said before, the human heart is both the place where we do our recycling. It's the alchemical crucible in which we transmute the past, but it's also the place where we invite the future to be born. So what I gather from what Teilhard de Chardin is telling us is that we're just about to rediscover together the power of this fire. And the fire we discovered in the beginning was fire by friction, banging the rocks together. When pieces of matter interact, they create sparks. The fire of love, this second fire that he talks about, is really the fire that is ignited when I merge my life with a greater life. Therefore, it's the fire of fusion. It's a nuclear reaction through fusion to release the light. So I always go back to this quote of Teilhard de Chardin because it's a very powerful one, and it does give a hint of what we're about to witness and also what we've been invited to participate in together, which is the lighting of the fire of love in every human heart. Without that, I don't think we can dispel the darkness. So I believe it is our shared destiny, and it's also our joyful responsibility to help manifest that which has been called the coming new soul-centered civilization, or a civilization at whose center burns the fire of love. And many indigenous peoples, when they gather, they always gather in a circle around a fire. I believe we're being invited as one human family to gather around this new fire together. This new fire, the fire of love, is going to be the central fire of our new civilization. So I'd like to just remind us of what Dr. Assagioli pointed out earlier. I quoted him. He said, The illumined soul, which has vitally experienced the purifying and elevating action of suffering, not only does no longer flee it, not only endures it patiently and accepts it with goodwill, but finally comes to rejoice in it. The strength of the Spirit renders the cross light. The light of the Spirit renders the cross luminous. And the reason I repeat this, because it's a very powerful statement, I'm just wondering, how do you register it? What does it mean to you in hearing this statement? How are you facing the suffering? The suffering that may exist inside you, the suffering around you at the moment in your community, in your family. How are you handling it? How are you dealing with it? I mean, all of us are being tested to the hilt. And that's why I go back to some of my mentors, like Dr. Roberto Assagioli, and know that not only did he believe in this, but he embodied joy, he embodied wisdom. So I know it's possible. It's like when you see somebody else do it, you know it can be done. They're pioneers. So we do have pioneers who have shown that joy and hope are fires that can be lit inside every human heart. So as I've said before, our human family actually stands at a critical crossroad. We seem to be knocking on the door of a better future, but the door or the portal remains temporarily barred and closed. And it's barred and protected, and we can't get through it because standing at the threshold as guardian is someone called the dweller on the threshold. We're being denied access because collectively we have yet to find the magic key that's going to redeem the past and not unlock the gates of this desired new world. And as we said in other broadcasts, the dweller on the threshold represents all the unredeemed, all the unaccepted, all the unloved aspects of ourself that say you can't step into greater wholeness until you've embraced us. So it's really ourselves, it's the dark projection of ourselves that hasn't been brought into the light, hasn't been loved, and it stands in the way of us moving across the threshold into a new day, into a new dimension. And so what we're discovering is that the key that opens that door is love. First of all, love of ourself and the redeeming of those unloved aspects. So the hidden key is the fire of love, and it is safeguarded deep within our hearts. So we actually have to go into our hearts, retrieve this key to open the key collectively to the door that opens up to a new possibility, a new era. There's another way of looking at this, not just meeting the dweller on the threshold. There's another phrase that's used in the spiritual teachings. It's called the burning ground. So as a species, humanity, I believe at the moment we are crossing a burning ground where the purifying fires are available to consume the dross and detritus of the past in order to liberate us from a self-constructed prison of unskillful living. So when our psychic field has been sufficiently burned and cleared and the dweller courageously faced, the fire of love can then take up full residence. It can actually burn in its true fireplace, which is the heart. The heart is the true hearth of the fire of love. But to safely house and hold this divine fire, we have to build a suitable fireplace in which the spiritual combustion, the divine conflagration that is the spiritual life can occur. And as far as we know, the most suitable or the most apposite hearth is this open and loving heart. So I talked about the burning ground and the purifying fires. It's interesting to note how these purifying fires have been interpreted in the different religions. For instance, the Christian religion talks about hellfire. And you're going to burn in hell. Well, in fact, it really was the fires of purgatory. The soul says, oh, you need to be purified. I can give you a shower with water, but that will just cleanse you temporarily. The true agent of cleansing is called fire. And so we were invited into the fires of purgatory to, together with the fire, go through this alchemical process of transmutation. And we've got it wrong. We think it's a punishment. But going through the purifying fire, in fact, is the way of redeeming our darkness. It's the way of reaching heaven. It isn't though somebody's judged and saying you're going to hell. We end up as a result of how we've lived our life, how we've acted. But we can at any moment change it by declaring, I choose to live this way, and then backing it up with behavior. So I wanted to just mention that because I know I've had long conversations with people about burning in hell. Now, there are places that we go to when we leave this body, and we go to the place that corresponds to our level of consciousness. But for me, the origin of the fires of purgatory, they're benevolent. They're there as the part of the burning ground. I know I've put a lot of stuff out into the field, but I feel the urgency to at least name a few things that are on my heart and mind. So let's just step back, take a breath, and just let's recap the journey so far. So we noted that while surveying the social skies, it's sometimes hard to find a silver lining in the dark clouds. And these dark clouds seem to be amassing and encircling our world. And we noted that whenever we turn on global media, the outlets are transmitting a constant and disheartening litany of woes that obscure the bright spots that are actually arising in the collective psyche. And I would say, contrary to this bleak picture, there is much to celebrate, for the joyful news is that you and I are pregnant. We're carrying a child. We're carrying the promised child of a brighter future in our hearts. And it is swaddled in what I would say is our vivacious dreams, our aspirations. And these aspirations are what we've picked up from the call of the soul of our humanity. And I believe that no amount of outer gloom can really dampen the joyful expectancy that accompanies this promised inner birth of our essential divinity. It goes back to the principle of essential divinity. How do you give birth to the truth of who you are? You show up, practice, practice, practice. That classic joke of the person stopped another person in the street and say, how do I get to Carnegie Hall? And the person they asked, they didn't know it was actually a musician. And the musician said, practice, practice, practice. So how do we reveal and express our divine self, our essential divinity? Practice, practice, practice. So to go back to this whole notion of being pregnant and carrying the child of the future in our hearts, how do we get pregnant? I believe whenever we say yes and choose to wholeheartedly engage in life as a force for good, the seed of spirit seems to enter the womb of our heart, and then it's quickened by each act of kindness and caring. And the culmination of this way of living is a sublime gestation process. And then out of this, we get the full flowering and fostering of joy, goodwill, light, love, all the things that are destined to be revealed when the soul flowers on earth. So in these uncertain times of dissolution and destruction, I think it's good to remind each other that life is eternal, while its many forms of expression are temporal. And we've mentioned this before on several of our broadcasts, this whole notion of the ceaseless cycles of death and rebirth that carry the irrefrangible, the can't be broken human spirit forward on a wave of continuous renewal. So as one epoch dies, another one arises. And passing through the necessary painful passage of labor, it makes its appearance as the latest incarnation of the timeless soul of humanity. I believe that's what's happening now. We are born at an amazing time. It is the death and the final days of one epoch, and it is the beginning days of a new. And we have to juggle both. We have to stand in both these worlds. And so you see people walking with placards. You used to see them on the street. Repent, the end is nigh. I'd like to say rejoice. The beginning is here. To be joyful. So the world is expectant. And we're being called to be skillful midwives and assist in the delivery of our own spiritual birth. So if I were to use some poetic language, I would say the song of the soul of humanity is asking to be sung by a global choir, our one humanity. And by singing this together, we actually sing in the song lines of a new earth. So the question is, have we forgotten how to listen to that deep song? Have we forgotten how to sing in joyful celebration of life? And by way of an answer, I'd like to, by way of completion, share a story taken from the Agni Yoga teachings that addresses this theme, and it's on 2 slides, and I will read it now for you. Once, according to an old legend, there came a messenger from a distant world to give people equality, brotherhood, sisterhood, and joy. Long since had people forgotten their songs. They remained in a stupor of hate. The messenger banished darkness and crowdedness, smote infection, and instituted joyful labor. Hatred was stilled, and the sword of the messenger remained on the wall, but all were silent and knew not how to begin singing. Then the messenger assembled the little children, led them into the woods, and said to them, "These are your flowers, your brooks, your trees. No one has followed us. I shall rest, and you fill yourselves with joy." Thereupon, timidly, they ventured into the forest. At last, the littlest one came to a meadow and sighted a ray of the sun. Then a yellow oriole sounded its call. The little one followed it, whispering, and soon joyously he sang out, "The sun is ours." One by one, the children gathered upon the meadow, and a new hymn to light rang out. The messenger said, "Humanity has again begun to sing. Come is the date." So this beautiful passage from Agni Yoga says that we have to be like children again. Childlike, not childish. Be like little children. Stand in childlike wonder and awe, and to remember how to hear the song of our soul, and then to learn to sing it together. And after I had found this quote from Agni Yoga, I was actually reminded of the inauguration of the Meditation Mount International Garden of Peace way back in January of 2009. We had invited Robert Mueller, who was the former Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations, to officially open the space and to give a keynote address. And so we were proceeding in the ceremony, and Dr. Mueller was invited up to address us. But instead of speaking, he reached into his back pocket, he pulled out a harmonica, and he proceeded to play Beethoven's Ode to Joy. It was the most perfect keynote speech you could imagine. It was joy. And so I think that for me is a fitting place to end our journey today, that it is an ode to joy. And I believe the time has come for us to joyfully sing our hearts out together, to sing the love song that really is the signature tune of the soul of our one humanity. And may we do that with joy. So I'd like to take a deep breath or two with you, because this has been quite a journey. We've been going about 50 minutes, Earth time, but joy is timeless. So when you enter joy and when joy enters you, it's a timeless experience. So from all of us at Meditation Mount, particularly Joseph Carenza, who's working the magic behind the scenes, and myself, we thank you for your presence and your participation today in this View from the Mount broadcast. And from all of us, we bid you good night and a joy-filled future. Namaste. We salute the divinity in each other joyfully.